In the time we have left, I have a couple of questions for the panelists. It seems to me that liberty, or liberalism, and liberal democracy, and religious liberty in particular, in Europe is going to be a casualty, and is now a casualty of the United States decision to bring liberal democracy to Iraq. If we say that the war in Syria, if it comes directly from what we did in Iraq, the migration of so many war refugees into Europe is also a fruit of that war. We're starting to see now in Europe an illiberalism rising. We all know that liberalism has been questioned in a general way by the times in which we live, but in particular in Europe, you're seeing the rise of nationalist politicians who are quite concerned about whether or not Europe is going to be able to absorb a lot of Muslim refugees, and what that is going to mean for the future of liberty itself in Europe. What I'd like to know is your thoughts on whether or not religious liberty can be sustained in Europe when there is such a clash of civilizations with so many Muslim refugees clashing or butting up against an increasingly nationalist European population.
I take it that's for me.
And Danielle, too.
And Danielle as well. Danielle, wouldn't you like to answer that first?
Go ahead.
Of course, it's a major challenge, the influx of refugees, most of whom are Muslim, and some of whom are mounting a severe challenge to the, if you like, the identity of countries like France and Germany, other Western European countries. There's no question that this is deeply disruptive. One can question, and I certainly do, the wisdom of the immigration policies that just simply open the doors without discernment of what the impact would be. So I do accept the proposition, which I think is, you actually said it, and is the premise of your question, that this is disruptive. But I would also say that I think the status of religious liberty in Europe has long been weak and impoverished, and particularly the understanding of religious liberty as something that involves public religious expression and the public involvement of religious individuals and groups in the lives of nations and societies, including in the development of public policy and laws. I think this is, in this sense, the French understanding of religious freedom, laïcité, which is a subordination of religion, a privatization of religion, a removal of it from public life. It's not just about the wearing of the burqa or the hijab or the cross. That's the sort of the public face of the issue. But laïcité, really for 2 centuries, although it's emerged in the 20th century, in France has meant the privatization of religion. So I think that this understanding has dominated European culture and politics for decades and has weakened their capacity to deal with the immigration of any kind of religious community, especially Islam. In my view, one of the reasons that, of course, we have not had, I will admit, we have not had what Europe has faced in the last few years, but we've had Muslims in the United States for a couple of hundred years and an influx of Muslims, and we have not seen, by and large, the kind of radicalism or political Islamism that you had referred to earlier, Rod, in the United States. And I think one reason for that, there are many, opportunity, economic opportunity and so forth. One reason is religious liberty. I view it as a sort of a counter-extremism weapon, if you can put it that way, that Europe lacks and has lacked for a long time, and that is to say the integration of all religious groups. The whole history of America has been the absorption of ethnic and national and religious groups, including Catholics. So Europe is particularly weakened, and I think in addition to this unwise influx, particularly in Germany, is a weakened condition, in part because of World War I, but also in part because of a very thin and impoverished understanding of what religious liberty is. And I think that's true of all the countries of Europe, including the United Kingdom.
Well, thank you. It's a tough question, certainly, which is why it's a good question. In the context outside of this line of work that I do sometimes speak about religious freedom in the U.S. and in the West more generally. And often my opening line is that my work in international religious freedom certainly makes the problems we face in the West pale in comparison to what we see in some of the places we've described today and other places as well. But the lesson that I always say we need to take from that is not that we shouldn't be concerned about religious freedom in the West, but we should be even more sensitive to how precious that inheritance is and how fragile it is, and in fact, how vigilant we need to be to defend it, because we cannot and should not take for granted the culture that's necessary to sustain what we have in terms of liberty in general and religious liberty in particular. I mean, if there's something I think that when people like the American conservative folks, and I don't want to name anyone in particular because I don't have quotes for it, but when people of that set oppose the Iraq War, I think one of the strongest points of argument there, and this wasn't just reflexive, just well we hate George Bush, so anything he does is wrong, that you might have gotten from opponents on the left, but this was a real a good faith disagreement by people who said you can't just liberate people from tyranny, from political oppression, and expect that the conditions for republicanism, small r, for liberty will be present and will allow a normal liberal system, again classical liberal system, to flourish. That the West has 2,000 plus years of cultural baggage in the good sense that makes our life possible, and that was a good point, and it certainly proved to be correct. And so the lesson for us is that culture really matters. And so Europe is in a tough situation of trying to balance, on one hand, the mercy and sympathy and aid that we probably all owe as human beings to refugees, and the need to defend the kind of culture that will make Western-style liberalism continually possible and sustainable. And of course, now you see a backlash. Not all the backlash has good motivations, but you see a backlash in European nationalism by some who want to ensure that that culture is preserved. And that's not just xenophobia. There may be xenophobic people, certainly, but it's not just xenophobia. It's people who recognize that it's important. The United States is also seeing massive cultural changes as a result of immigration. They may be good, they may be bad, but it's really there. And so we need to focus on how vulnerable culture is and think of a way. Now, I don't have a solution to this problem, but it's a real tension. It's not just good guys versus bad guys, because there's, of course, a need to aid the world, and then also a need to preserve the kind of culture that makes liberty possible.
We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask everyone on the panel, if you were advising political leaders, as religious believers yourself, if you were advising political leaders marching up to the next war to consider the religious freedom angle of going to war, now, what would you say to them to add to their discernment? Now, I know it's hard to do that without having particulars like what we're going to war about, but as a general matter, given the things we've said today about the unintended consequences of war on religious practice and religious liberty, are there any general principles that you would say ought to be part of future debates?
Pastor.
They're all looking at me. I would say, the concept of respect for life. I would plead with political leaders to respect any point of view and any belief, and reverence for life, and keep it as simple as that, because there's a role for government, for policy, for politics, and as a person of faith, I believe that our call should be the conscience of the country, that love everybody, but still respect the need for each country to govern itself and to protect its interests.
I can also be very brief, just following on my own remarks as well, to think about it, as you say, it's an impossible question without the context, but to think about, which we did not in Iraq, of course, but what will it look like on the ground after the war? What will the conditions for religious liberty be when the fighting is done and then a people is left there to try to rebuild? And second, what will be irreparably lost if we do or don't, or irretrievably lost if we do or don't fight? What lives, of course, what else can't be rebuilt after the war?
I would say don't go to war unless vital American interests are at stake, but I can envision a case in which the existence of terrorism, whether it's Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram or ISIS, can threaten vital American interests, including the homeland, and that this is the scenario that was laid out in the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. But if you're going to do this, you must not assume that simply toppling the dictator is going to allow the springing up of a stable democracy. It was foolhardy. We didn't do the work. It's hard work. It may, in fact, be necessary in the future. I fear that Iraq is on the road to becoming a majoritarian Muslim tyranny in which Shia and Sunni simply go at each other without any kind of infrastructure, political, social, cultural, or otherwise. All of the non-Muslim minorities are going to disappear from Iraq. And if that happens, it becomes once again simply a training ground for the kind of terrorism that can impact us. And so, to me, that is a national security issue. But it's much harder than simply defeating an army and declaring victory.
Yeah, I'd like to conclude by reflecting on the unintended consequences, the tragedy of war, by talking very briefly about a country I care about a lot, the Netherlands. Prior to the Second World War, the Netherlands was one of the most religious countries in the world. Lots of Catholics there, lots of Protestants, of course. Then came the Nazi occupation and the experience of the Second World War. There's not a Dutchman alive who would say that that war shouldn't have been fought to free their own country from Nazi tyranny. But after the war was concluded and the Nazis had been defeated, the religious organizations in the country, not only the churches, but also civic organizations based around religion, they came back together to try to reconstitute what had been there before. But their hearts weren't in it. And so when the first winds of the counterculture began to blow in the 1960s, it all collapsed. Today, the Netherlands is a wonderful place, but it's also a very atheistic country, a very secular country, a country where very few people go to church at all. So that was a war that had to be fought, but we now see it led, the trauma of that war and the Nazi occupation led to the evaporation of religion in the Netherlands, and what started out the 20th century as one of the most religious countries in Europe. Religious liberty doesn't matter if there is no religion to practice or nobody in a society or a country to practice that religion. This, I think, is something we should keep in mind before we're quick to go to war, even necessary wars, that they do have these consequences that we may not be able to foresee, but we ought to keep that in mind because we have examples all around us within living memory of this sort of thing happening. I want to thank all the panel here. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, George, for having us.